Hello again, everybody. This is Mr. Everything. I'm coming at you with another Wargaming in Miniature video. In this video, we're going to be continuing our series of Bolt Action Boot Camp. In this series, we're going to be going over the rules for anybody that needs or wants to learn the rules, as well as I might be able to provide some insight to some veteran players. In this video, we're going to be talking about movement. Fire and maneuver is the key to winning battles. You need to shoot. You also need to move. Make use of cover. Sometimes there's going to need to be rapid movement. Sometimes there's going to be slow movement, cautious advance, terrain, things like that. So we're going to go over all that in this video. We already went over the order dice, so that's not going to be a focus of this video. What we're going to be talking about is the actual physical moving of the units. Okay, infantry usually has a movement of 6 inches. 6 inches is your standard infantry movement, and that is so like on an advance order, you would move 6 inches and still shoot. If you decided to do a run order, instead of shooting, you would move an additional 6 inches. So, like in this case, this unit could move 6 inches, right, and still fire. Or if they felt like they needed to run, they could run 12 inches. And you could measure the 12 inches and then they could run. Interpenetration of units, like if I've got a second unit here and I need to move through him, there's no problem. You can move through him. But remember, when you finish your move, you cannot be within 1 inch of a friendly unit. So I couldn't move him and stop him right there because that's less than 1 inch. I would have to move beyond that, and hopefully there is enough movement to get that done. There should be no problem. These bases aren't, 6 inches in diameter, or even 4 inches, because you're going to have to be at least 1 inch behind the unit, because at the end of the last turn, you couldn't do it. And then when you move, you got to be at least 1 inch in front of that unit. Again, there should be no problem. And if there is a problem with that, then you just have to go around. All right, now terrain. This is a big aspect of a miniatures game, is the fact that you're going to have all different types of terrain. You're going to have walls, barricades, buildings, rough ground, hedges, wood lines. You're going to have all different types of terrain on a battlefield. That's why you play miniatures games. You play miniatures games for the 3D aspect. If you didn't want 3D, go play a computer game or go play a board game. But at the beginning of the game, both players need to understand what each of the pieces of terrain are, because you might have some thing out on the table that your opponent doesn't understand what it is. You and your opponent need to understand and come to an understanding of what each of the pieces of terrain are. In some scenarios, it's clearly defined what each of the pieces of terrain are, and you can go by that. But if it's not defined, and hypothetically, let's say I've got this patch of woods here, if you have a referee, he'll tell you what it is. If you don't have a referee, come to an understanding. This is either rough ground or it's not rough ground. It's either light cover or it's heavy cover. It's your decision. These are either light because they're boxes or heavy cover because they're full of concrete. This wall might be considered light cover because it's a low wall. This is a higher wall. It might be considered heavy cover. The building, it's a building. It's always going to be a building. Some terrain features might be completely impassable, like a river or a bog or something. You and your opponent decide on what's impassable. Now, 99% of your battlefield is going to be open ground. It's going to be, you want it to be open ground, free movement by everyone. But there is such a thing as rough ground, and if you are trying to move through rough ground, there is a chart. And in this chart, it'll tell you infantry, artillery, and then in vehicles, they break it down into wheeled and tracked vehicles. Okay? So, let's talk about infantry just for a second. Infantry can go through rough ground or over an obstacle, like an obstacle here or a wall, or any kind of linear thing is considered an obstacle. They can't run. They can still advance, which is 6 inches, and still shoot. They just can't do the 12-inch move over rough ground or an obstacle. In a building, it's okay. In a road, it's okay. In open ground, it's okay. Okay, now artillery. We got your anti-tank gun, or you've got your howitzer, or you have whatever. Open ground, of course, it's okay. Rough ground, can't move. Can't move in rough ground. They can't move over an obstacle. They can't move into a building. But on a road, they can move. So basically, they're limited to open ground only. Okay, then you have wheeled vehicles like trucks. Okay, you've got wheeled vehicles like trucks. Open ground is okay. I'm going to say open ground is okay for every unit, so I'm going to stop saying that. They cannot move through rough ground. They cannot cross an obstacle. They can't go into a building. But the advantage of being on a road means they get to double their move. Tracked vehicles. They can move through rough ground. They just can't run, so they're doing in advance. They can go over, like a tracked vehicle, it can go over an obstacle, like a barricade or a wall or a hedge, with no hindrance. So basically it just drives right over it. The only obstacle that would stop a tracked vehicle is anti-tank obstacles. Anti-tank obstacles become impassable to a tank. And again, on a road, they get double their movement. Now we'll discuss buildings in their own section. Buildings have their own rules. Okay, there's two other things that you have to consider. It's moving off the table and moving onto the table. Those are special types of moves. And there's also a third type of move which is called flanking, which is basically you have a unit that's not been deployed on the table, it's off the table, but what it's doing is it's moving along the outside of the battlefield up the sides. Okay, normally when a unit moves onto the table and you draw an order die, you assign it to one of your off-table units, you designate a point on the table that it's moving on from, and then you just measure from there. They can move, they can advance, they can even run. They just can't do any close assaulting. Moving off of a table. Units, you can't voluntarily leave the battlefield, but maybe in a scenario you have to exit a certain number of units off the table. When they do, they're completely removed off the table and you remove their die out of the bag. Now there are buildings like this, we're going to talk about this just super shortly. There are buildings like this one from Pegasus that you can take the roof off and you can put your troops inside the building. If you do not have that, if you've got like a solid resin building or your model of your building is completely glued down or something like that, you can enter the building and then take the models off the table and say, okay, these guys are all inside that building. Or you might say, okay, there's my squad leader, he's inside the building. You know, you put one model next to it or something to represent your squad being inside the building. Or you as a player and your opponent can just designate the buildings as impassable. They're just obstacles to walk around. That's your choice. Okay, now I talked about this in a previous video, but this is pretty important. Formation of your unit. Okay, now this is part of movement. It's not in this chapter. It's actually in a previous chapter. But you have a formation, and your formation means your units have to be within 1 inch of each other to be considered in formation. Okay, so you just use your 1-inch template, or you use your ruler, or whatever you're using, just to make sure they're all within 1 inch of each other. And when you move, they have to maintain that. And you move individual models, you don't move the unit. So what I mean by that is when you're given a movement order, you measure from each model. So I don't just take this model, move him 6, and then put everybody within 1 inch of him. That's not what I do. What I do is I move him 6, and then him 6, and then him 6, and then him 6, and him 6, and they all still have to stay within 1 inch. If for some reason I'm not able to do that, like let's say I had a bunch of guys here like this, and this guy was killed last turn, so now they're separated, but I still want to move this way as fast as possible. This guy cannot move his full 6 because these guys would not be able to catch up. They have to get back into formation. They have to be within 1 inch of each other. So what I do is I move the guy that can't move who's furthest back. This is just I move him his 6 inches, knowing he's the trail guy. Now I just go ahead and put everybody up you know, I move the front guy now 6 inches, all right? And let's see if I can get this guy up there. You know, might have to pull him back a little bit. See what I mean? Okay, as a final comment, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about flanking, because it's in a different chapter. It's in the scenario chapter, but it is a movement, so I need to talk about flanking. So you have models that are on the table. You have models that are not on the table that will move onto the table. The ones that move onto the table might be considered in reserve. Some of your scenarios might designate certain units to be reserve units. These reserves are usually kept off the table. You can designate any of your reserve units to be attempting an outflank maneuver. Now you have to indicate which units are outflanking to your opponent, but you don't have to tell them if they're going left or if they're going right. That you just write down on a piece of scratch paper. You say, you know, Squad Alpha is going to the left and Squad or Tank Bravo is going to the right, or whatever. And then you keep that hidden from your opponent. You can divide them up, you can have them all go to the same side, whatever. Okay, units attempting an outflank must be given a down order on the first and second turn. On turn 3 or onwards, you can issue them an advance or run order just like any other unit entering the board. To give them that advance or run order, you have to make an order test with a -1. Okay, so on turn 3, you can move in anywhere from 24 inches or closer. Because remember, those first 2 turns are down. Technically, they're maneuvering during those 2 turns. So the first turn they went 12 inches, second turn they went 24 inches. So you can only come on from the 24-inch or closer point. Every additional turn that they want to come on, you can add an additional 12 inches. So remember, turn 3, 24 inches. Turn 4, 36 inches. Turn 5, 48 inches. All right, I hope that explained movement and outflanking. And come back for the next video, which will be shooting. See you on the battlefield.